Up in the conference room, the men gathered about Gordon at the controls. He checked the autopilot and sat drumming his fingers on the desk. Finally he looked squarely at the language expert. "Mr. Stewart, it seems fairly obvious now that the outcome of this entire expedition depends almost solely on you. You're the one who knows how to convey ideas, probably as well as any human being alive, according to the information we got before we asked you to join us. All the rest of us can do is run the ship and make like space fighters." He raised a hand at Stewart's beginning protest, and went on. "Let me finish my little speech. You're trained for this sort of thing, even if you do lack non-terrestrial experience. You figured out the elements of the Alpha Centauri 2 and 4 languages from nothing but sound movies, a few years back. Now, what I'm getting at is this: you tell us what has to be done, and we'll try to figure out a way to do it. We're starting from scratch. Of course, that meteor, by 1,000,000 to 1 chance, ruined all our previous plans." Stewart pulled at his ear a moment. "Well, all those plans were designed to give me at least the minimum amount of observation I'd need to prepare a friendly message. Now, while my stock of Azura symbols is still 0, we've gained some information. It's too bad we lost the horses and bloodhounds, for the combination can't be beaten when it's a matter of finding someone in hiding. However, we do know where at least 3 natives are. And personally, I don't regret it a bit that I'll not make use of those hasty riding lessons." He paused, and White spoke up. "Even if we do know where some of them are, I don't see how we can use Plan 1. How can we set up hidden microphones and telecons, when the ruddy natives live in a cave?" Bretner, looking disgusted, added, "Even when we catch one of the critters by dumb luck, he won't talk. Trained not to. And that tears up the second plan." The captain nodded. "And our third scheme, to watch and wait, using long-range equipment, and play for the breaks. That sure seemed like a flexible plan. But of course it was blown all over the Milky Way along with our food. Anyway, the news from patrol makes speed essential." There was glum silence for a while. Then Rogers offered, "There must be some way we can use our knowledge of where at least 3 of them are hiding, even if the place is defended with the natural barricade and a top-pack howitzer." After a thoughtful moment, the little language expert cleared his throat hesitantly. I should like to suggest something." They all looked at him, making him feel rather self-conscious, but he went on. "You said something about an old-fashioned billboard, Gordon, that got me thinking. I have a good many pictures of the expedition and their activities." He reddened, remembering the frequent trippings about his photographic activity, "and I can make a few sketches for the rest of it. You see, I was thinking we could sneak down there at night and leave a series of pictures where the natives would find them in the morning." He was talking rapidly now, full of steam, pacing back and forth. "The pictures would show that we are not the invaders, that we are friendly. I took pictures of Rogers helping the monkey rats, for instance, and then we could have a couple of pictures of terrestrials and Azurans exchanging gifts." He stopped, embarrassed, wondering whether his scheme sounded naive to these practical men. It's been tried before with considerable success, in some cases." Gordon thought it over a while, rubbing the stubble on his cheeks. "Might work," he mused aloud. "What about setting up an automatic sequence gimmick of some kind, controlled from here while we watch the reaction with the telescope? We could turn the pages, see? Or should we just tack up a string of pictures along the path?" Rogers sat forward. "Machine might be better, if we can rig it up soon enough. Separate pictures might get blown away or something, for all we know, or some kind of critter might destroy them." Stewart stopped pacing and squinted at the ceiling. "Yes, I like the machine. We could include a little pickup unit so I could record and analyze their comments, knowing just what they were looking at. That would really help a lot." He snapped his fingers, struck with inspiration. "What about ending the little show with the real surprise? A gift that would really demonstrate our good intentions." What did he consider a suitable gift? "A blast rifle," he answered boldly. "What the devil?" exclaimed Gordon. The others indicated various degrees of consternation. They stared at Stewart as if he had suggested turning pirate. But he showed a firmness that was new to them, and to himself. "Nothing else will do the trick as simply and surely," he insisted. "In the first place, their most desperate need, as they see it right now, is probably an efficient but simple weapon of some sort, capable of being enlarged into a heavy defensive piece of great range. I understand our blast rifle is such a weapon. I believe they live in absolute terror of another attack, and they apparently have little or no technology left with which to prepare for such an attack. Hence they're going underground." He paused to let the point sink in. "And in the second place, it seems reasonable to believe they would understand our good intentions from such a gift. Surely they will see that no one planning an aggressive move is going to arm his intended victims first. Their behavior certainly indicates that they are accustomed to direct action, rather than to Machiavellian subtleties of plot and counterplot." Nestor stuck out a skeptical lower lip. "How will they know we're making a gesture that means anything? I mean, they still might figure the gun is just a little toy in our league, and that we're not running any risk at all by giving it to them." Stewart hesitated before replying. He nodded in appreciation of intelligent analysis. "That's a difficult point which will have to be worked out later, possibly on the spot. First of all, we shall have to establish contact. It will also be necessary to show them we have a defensive screen, too, which they would doubtless be overjoyed to have, and that we are willing to turn it off and trust them. It will be a delicate and intriguing problem in psychologic." Rogers shook his head and laughed a little. "It sounds as cockeyed as Uncle Willie Yellow's stories about Sinus V, but, so help me, I believe it'd work." All at once his expression changed, and he looked hard at the expert. "One thing, though, mister. I know I wouldn't care for the job. Who's going to be the guinea pig and go down for the first little chat with them?" Stewart smiled thinly. "Who will bell the cat, eh? Another fair question. Well, I shall set up the apparatus, and of course I intend to try out its effect, too. I shall confront the natives myself after they have received our picture message in the gun." The others protested, but there was a stubborn set to his jaw. "After all," he explained later to Gordon, "while you fellows have been acquiring glamour, so to speak, I've been leading a rather dull life. I intend to have at least one little fling at dangerous living. Besides, I'm the only really expendable man in the crew, the rest of you are necessary to the operation of the special agent. And anyway, I'm only here because I know something about communicating ideas. This is part of my job, if anything is." The rest of the day and a major part of the night, except for brief catnaps, were spent in fabricating the device which Gordon designed to Stewart's specifications. Even White's work on the mosaic alarm was suspended. The linguist planned, sketched, and worked with his photographs for 10 hours before allowing himself to rest. He had done all he could with his part of the project, and decided to lend a hand in the shop, but first he would massage the leg which had been so painfully gouged when the meteor struck. He sat down to ease the ache, and promptly fell asleep. When they woke him 3 hours later, his machine was ready. In his meticulous way, he had made careful notes of the picture sequence, and other 5 members of Contact, Incorporated had arranged everything as indicated. He examined the device sleepily, rubbing the back of his neck and yawning. "Looks okay," he grunted. "Controls tested. Good. Nice job, very nice." Still blinking, he helped carry the makeshift metal and plastic assembly into the scout ship in number 3 lock. Brittner climbed in and sat down next to him at the controls. "Sort of a lucky thing for us this old planet has 4 moons," grinned the scout. "All 4 were in the sky until a few minutes ago. Too much light for us to pussyfoot around on the surface, so you and I had a chance for a nap. Now there's only 2, just enough for us to work by. We'll have to hustle though." A few minutes later, under Brittner's skillful handling, the little ship settled to a quick, silent landing about 2 kilometers from the cave. The scout got out and began unloading the apparatus. Stewart, now fully alert, held a low-voiced radio conversation with Gordon. "Still no sign of any activity?" The captain's voice was blurred with fatigue. "No, nothing, except some infrared indications of large animals to the south. We'll keep you informed. For Pete's sake, be careful." The linguist, nervous as he was, chuckled. "Good of you to remind us." He put on his bone conduction earpiece, throat mic, and all the other gear designed for planets with breathable atmospheres. Clambering out of the little vessel, he joined Brittner. The 2 men helped each other with the slings of their backpacks, locked up the ship, and started off. Stewart had to run occasionally to keep up with the other's easy, practiced stride. The extra rifle and his half of the apparatus jounced and dug into his back. Occasionally he heard Brittner whisper into his mic, asking for directions. The compass was useless near the iron-bearing coral rocks. Like the scout, Stuart had studied the route in advance, but traversing it in the dark was a grimly different matter. The double shadows of the two moons were confusing and made him stumble. Once a sensitive bush of some kind shuddered and drew back with a moan when he grasped it for support. He shuddered and brushed sweat off his face and sleeve. What did anyone know, after all, about the number of dangerous organisms this planet harbored? Carnivorous plants, for instance, or even animals, might not have sense enough to avoid iron complexes such as human blood. Something soft beneath his foot shrieked horribly in the night and slid away. He went down on one knee, but waved when Bretner turned as if to help him up. "I'm letting this get me," he thought angrily. He got up and jogged along again, trying to imitate the scout's powerful stride. Abruptly they came upon the trail. They had just started along it when a warning came from the special agent. "One of those animals on the prairie must have picked up your scent. Probably a hellcat sloping off toward the trail now. Ye gods, he must be doing 60 kilometers. Now he's slowing. You should see him about 100 meters ahead in a few seconds. He's sneaking onto the trail." The linguist's heart thudded as he crouched in shadow with the scout. "What do we do, Bretner?" he whispered. "Have to use this," the other replied, hauling out a wide-barreled, clumsy-looking Texas slugger. "Picked up the Sweetheart on Callisto, but I only got 3 shells." He aimed down the path through an offset sight. "Don't get behind this, laddie." In the moonlight farther up the trail, a sinuous beast like a huge armor-plated cat glided out from the brush. It opened jaws a meter wide, showing double rows of dull green phosphorescent teeth, and began to lope toward the men. The scout fired when it was less than 60 meters away, and a rocket-propelled projectile hissed out toward it. A few meters out, the 2000 G drive of the projectile cut in, and the missile crashed into the Hellcat with terrible impact. The creature was a hollow mass of pulp almost instantaneously. The only sounds had been the brief hiss of the rocket, the even shorter crackling of the accelerated drive, and an earth-shuddering crunch when the device had struck a wall of rock beyond the beast. Apparently these had not alarmed the other nocturnal creatures about, for the various animal cries went on as before. "Come on," said the scout, resuming the trail. "We got to hurry." Stuart followed, wrinkling his nose at the horrible stench of the dead animal. Nearby, a brightly glowing hole in the rock showed where the missile had buried itself and disintegrated. By the time the men reached their objective, a little trail-side clearing just out of sight from the cave, the language expert was thoroughly winded. It was some satisfaction to him to note that the scout was sweating heavily too. Bretner unshouldered his equipment, took a sip of water from his canteen, and moved up the path a few meters to keep watch on the cave. The opening glowed less brightly than the luminescent rock around it. Stuart worked as rapidly as he could in the moonlight and ghostly shine of the hill. His footing was uncertain on the irregular coral. Twice he stopped and crouched, rifle ready, as his sensitive ears detected a change in the pattern of night sounds. A wild assortment of odors drifted with the faint breeze. Once a friendly little creature smelling like fragrant scotch offered him a pebble and giggled. In his anxious haste, the linguist dropped 2 bolts into the twisted crevices of the rock, and he began to feel he was having a nightmare. When the assembly was nearly completed, Nestor warned over the radio, "Better step on it, guys. We can see daylight coming from up here. You have about half an hour to get away." By the time the device was operating satisfactorily, there was enough light to see clearly. The 2 men on the ground picked up the tools and canteens hastily and hurried back along the trail. They had gone about halfway when a stone the size of a baseball landed with the vicious clank on the scout's headgear. He swore softly and sagged against a bush, fighting dizzily to stay on his feet. Stuart snatched up a smaller rock and hurled it at the attacking stone hawk, which was banking into another dive in the dim morning light. The stone smashed one wing. The creature spun and flopped through the air, screaming and gobbling, until it crashed into a tree and fell dead. Bretner shook his head and grinned ruefully. "Good thing I got a wooden head. Yeah, I'm okay." He examined the dent in his helmet, and spit contemptuously at the dead hawk. "That's some arm you've got, mister," he added respectfully. Stuart examined his arm, pleased. "Used to pitch on the varsity," he explained. "Did you hear the mouthings of that vicious bird? He was swearing at us, I'm sure." He resumed the march, wondering absently whether all these Azuran creatures spoke basically the same language. From what little he had been able to observe, it seemed likely. It was almost full daylight when they reached their scout ship. "Come on up," Nestor told them. "No sign of activity around the cave yet, but you better keep between it and the sun just in case somebody peeks." Brittner took off immediately. 10 minutes later Stuart was seated at his apparatus, stuffing breakfast food into his mouth and feeling very tired. "Been making this stuff for 150 years, he grumbled to himself, chewing doggedly, "and it's still lousy." Suddenly he dropped his spoon and adjusted the view screen controls. Gordon walked in, buttoning up his dungarees and yawning. "Brother," said the chief, "when we get back we're going to sleep for 2 weeks." He looked at the busy linguist and was immediately wide awake. "What's up?" Stuart pointed to the screen. Native just peeked out. He reached over toward one of the cephaloids, mindless brains with tremendous memory and dissociative power, and began flipping switches. Activating solution flowed through the microcellular colloid, little lights on a panel winked on as the surface potentials reached operating level. The linguist glanced briefly at the screen. "I guess there's time to show you one of its little tricks, just to warm it up," he said. He sang, in universal speech, a couple of ribald verses of the Venus of Venus, then touched a switch. Immediately the song came back at him through a little speaker, but in English, and with the unmistakable drawl of Rogers. "I conditioned it a few minutes ago with his voice," explained Stuart. He was delighted with Gordon's reaction of incredulous astonishment. "It's really a wonderful mechanism, Gordon." Oops. There's a native." He jabbed hastily at the primary condition stud, erasing the song in the accent, and switched on the remote control for the picture sequence. He handed Gordon a headset. "Will you monitor the pickup, please? The rest of this stuff will keep me busy." He fell silent, watching the screen. Gordon reached over and switched on the movie camera set up beside him to record the scene. The 3 scarlet natives had come out of the cave. They stood in a patch of brilliant sunlight, swinging their middle limbs about and playing with the sassy little monkey rat as men would with a fox terrier. At length they picked up what seemed to be a crossbow and several spears, slung bundles across their sloping shoulders, and started down the trail. They walked slowly, spears at the ready, and were obviously alert. Frequently they glanced up, or paused as if listening. Rounding a turn, the lead native stopped abruptly, leapt back and dropped flat. The other 2 dropped almost simultaneously. The leader motioned cautiously for his companions to crawl forward. He pointed with the tentacular upper limb toward the picture sequence machine gleaming in the morning light. On it was showing a picture of a native, enlarged from Stuart's picture of his temporary prisoner. The semanticist had evidently made a good guess in alien psychology, for no hostile move was made toward the machine. The natives lay there studying it, making occasional guarded gestures to each other. They stiffened as the next picture flipped into view. It was a terrestrial family with 2 children. It was the picture Stuart kept beside his bunk, and was the best thing he could think of to put across the concept of a peaceful people. Still no hostile move. No sounds, either, except the background chirping and jabbering of other animals. Anxiously, Stuart fussed with his controls. He flipped to the next picture and a dozen after that without getting an audible response. The natives were shown views of terrestrial life, New York and the spaceport, the special agent, and 2 views of the receding Earth. Then the linguist tried one of his sketches. It showed a globular ship, such as the invaders were believed to have used, attacking the terrestrial ship. In the following sketches, the Earth ship was damaged, but managed to destroy the other. One of the natives was evidently jolted into comment at this point. "Aru," came distinctly over the loudspeaker. Stuart immediately murmured picture 15 in universal speech into his microphone. He beamed at Gordon, relaxed a little, and hit the sequence button again. The next set of pictures showed the approach to Azura, the landing, and Roger's kindly treatment of the monkey rats. Again a comment came from the middle native, evidently younger and less well trained. This time he uttered several syllables, which the cephaloid duly absorbed. The rear native thwacked him across the back angrily. Stuart bounced in his seat with silent glee. He made microscopic adjustments to the analyzer and continued the show. Behind him, the door opened quietly. Rogers came in with some breakfast for Gordon. The scout raised his eyebrows inquiringly. The chief winked and nodded at the screen, holding up a hand in the OK gesture. Stuart looked around at them, his finger hesitating over the sequence button. He shut off his mic for a moment. This is one of the parts I'm dubious about. We swing into our sales talk here. Man sees native, puts down gun, and approaches peacefully. Then they exchange gifts. He pushed the stud thoughtfully. If the response to this is favorable, do you think we ought to go ahead with the rest? The chief frowned. Sure. Why not? Well, I suppose it would be foolish to stop now. I don't have enough material yet to prepare a verbal message, and they seem to be understanding this one anyway. On the other hand, they might not like this. It shows us helping them to rebuild a city, and giving them weapons. He lit a cigarette and hit the button again. They might wonder what we want in return. Gordon put down his coffee and scratched his chin. Well, I don't think we ought to revise our plans now, Stuart. I think they'd be glad to offer us a base, in return for protection. We might as well go ahead. The linguist nodded. The minutes passed as he continued the series of pictures. After a while he opened his mouth to say something, but was interrupted by a gabble of sounds from the pickup unit. The natives were pointing upward and discussing something. Pilot lights on the cephaloid hookup showed that the material was being received, passed back and forth for analysis, and stored away. Stuart threw in a keyword now and then to identify the picture being shown. It's clear that they understand, he whispered. Now for the clincher. We help them fight off the invaders. I hope they don't get the idea that our presence would make another invader attack more likely. He continued to push the stud every 20 or 30 seconds, lips moving as he counted. When the counter showed the end of the sequence approaching, he nodded in satisfaction. The natives were still talking to each other. Good thing we've got these cephaloids, Stuart whispered. An electronic analyzer could never sort out the three voices. Nor could any linguist alive, for that matter. Once again he paused, finger hovering. This is where we show them pictures of a blast rifle, how to use it, and so on, and then the magic box opens and we give them one. His whisper was faint, and he swallowed. Should I go ahead? He seemed to be asking himself. Gordon studied him a few seconds. Play it your own way, Stuart. The risk is yours, so the decision ought to be. The linguist put out his cigarette with trembling fingers. Yes. I realize that I talked you into letting me go ahead with my own plan. But, you see, well, I've never done anything especially brave or dangerous, as all you fellows have. The plan might be made to work out without my actually going down there in person. I've been wondering what you would say if I backed out. The chief got up and clapped him on the back, awkwardly. Why, not a thing, Stuart. Wouldn't say a word. A man's personal project is his own, in this kind of business. Long as it doesn't affect the welfare of anyone else, he can volunteer for, or refuse, any job. Stuart smiled slowly and sat up straight. Then I'll go ahead. I just wanted to be sure I could have backed out if I'd wanted to. If I do something worthwhile, I want it to be without compulsion. He punched the sequence button vigorously, while the chief stared at him with amused respect. He grinned back at Gordon. Sit down, Captain, and keep an eye on the natives. Gordon sat, applying his attention to the scene on the ground. Think they'll get this part? They certainly ought to. I even made a sketch of a native destroying a hellcat with my new gun. After a few minutes of attentive study by the three natives, the series was finished. The language expert reached over and depressed a different stud without hesitation. There it is. A nice little blast rifle, practically new. The screen showed the front of a box falling open under the sequence machine. The three Azurans raised their heads and stared. Then they looked up at the sky, and back at the box. The conversation was excited, not at all hushed. Finally the leader sent the third native around in a flanking move, equipped with the crossbow. When the new position had been taken up, the three studied the situation and seemed to discuss its various aspects. Suddenly, while the flanker held a bead on the machine, the one who had been in the lead stood up and advanced warily toward the proffered gun. He studied it at close range, after looking over the scene carefully. Abruptly he laid down his spear and seized the blast rifle. He remained crouching, obviously waiting for something to happen. When nothing did, he straightened up and began to examine the weapon. He turned to the last picture, still showing on the machine, and carefully conformed his tentacles around the gun's tack as indicated. Then he looked about, as if seeking a target. A large, brilliant blue tree about 20 meters away seemed to be his choice. He spent a moment getting the sights lined up and then pulled the trigger. The entire lower half of the tree disappeared in a tremendous explosion of steam and splinters. The upper part of it came smashing down, as did great sections of others directly behind the target. The stunned native staggered to his feet, still clutching the gun, and cooed at it lovingly. His two companions came running up, whistling and gabbling with excitement. They were allowed to take the gun up on the hill and try it out, at more distant targets. Several trees and the good-sized rock disappeared with a noisy violence that was obviously satisfactory. The leader remained with the picture machine and began to examine it. He jumped, startled, when Stuart flipped one more sketch into view. It showed the little scout ship about to land. After the native had studied it a while, Stuart gave him the last one. This was a sketch of the linguist himself, stepping out of the scout ship and greeting the waiting Azuran. The reaction to this was immediate and positive. Shrill commands sent the smaller native into ambush in the shrubbery, the other came running down the hill, handed over the gun, and fled to the cave. The leader, still watching the sky, squatted down to wait, rifle beside him. After a moment he took something out of his knapsack and apparently began to munch on it. Twice he snatched up the gun and sighted through it, as though practicing. Stuart frowned at the screen. They seem to understand I'm about to visit them, but they're not convinced they can trust visitors. No reason why they should be, I suppose. He disconnected the pickup unit from the cephaloid circuit. Gordon cocked his head to one side reflectively. Well, I don't think the situation is too bad. You've seen how cautious they are. They must have been very badly scared when their cities were destroyed. Perfectly natural. It's also evident they're not fundamentally warlike. Their behavior shows an absence of military background. Even a couple of traders noticed that, by the way, over on the other side of the planet last year. The linguist shook his head reprovingly. Let's avoid semantic confusions when we can, Gordon. Their behavior does not fit in with your notion of military background. We have no right to say what it connotes in their culture. The captain acknowledged the reasonableness of this statement with a smile and left him to the solitude he needed. He began the task of receiving the material the Cephades had assimilated, feeding in associations of probable general context with the natives' comments regarding each picture. He laughed to himself as he realized that a certain amount of projection of his own notions was inevitable. Such was the tremendous power of the cephaloids, and the delicate, almost intuitive skill of his handling, that the major part of the analysis was complete in little more than an hour. He switched the controls to translate, University SP. To other. Indicator needles shifted and steadied as the surface potentials readjusted into semi-living colloids. Then, before proceeding further, he asked the captain to join him again. When Gordon was seated, the expert smiled wryly at him. This is usually considered very poor procedure, but there's only one word I can be fairly sure of as a check on this thing. It seems reasonable that, when the middle native exclaimed "Daru," he meant good. That was when we destroyed the attacking ship, if you remember, a little fiction which I shall have to explain to them later. Into the microphone he said, in universal speech, "Good. That is good." "Aru. Aru now low," replied the loudspeaker. Stuart, though he relaxed a little then, lost no time. It took him only a few minutes to memorize several phrases which the jelly and silver translator gave him. By the time Bretner had the little scout ship warmed up for him, Stuart was prepared to tell the natives, "Peace. I come in peace. Your people and my people have the same enemy. Therefore let us be friends and work together. We shall give you large and strong weapons." He turned to leave the lab, but stopped to squint once more at the screen. Only the native with the gun was visible, still grimly waiting. The linguist finished buckling on his gear with nervous fingers. "They look awfully well disciplined to me," he murmured to himself. "Wish I felt a little more nonchalant about this." He clumped down the passageway to number 3 lock, where he met Bretner climbing out of the scout ship. Bretner slapped him on the back, saying, "She's all wound up. Good luck, chum. Keep away from the girlies, here." From the control room, Rogers shouted gaily, "Send us a postcard, laddie. One of them Venus type." The two scouts guffawed heartily. Gordon looked out and waved at him. The linguist climbed into the control seat, laughing in spite of himself. He waved at Bretner, shut the inner door, and opened the outer. A monitor light showed green. "Ready," he told the intercom. He was surprised at how steady his voice and hands were. "Cast off," came Gordon's voice. "Why?" He touched the release button and felt himself flung away from the special agent. He boosted his little vessel around a semicircle several kilometers in diameter, as he had been instructed, so the position of the big ship would not be given away when he approached the ground. He overmodulated the drive then, to make plenty of noise, and headed directly for the waiting native. Over a suitable grassy spot, he waited until he was sure the Azuran had seen him, then he eased down slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves. He landed with the nose about 10 degrees too low, settled with a rolling bump, and opened the port as soon as he could manage. He mumbled to himself a bit, practicing his little speech. Then he stepped out. The blast rifle looked like a 90mm projector. It scowled viciously at his abdomen from only 20 paces away. He swallowed several times and managed a trembly little smile. The native continued to inspect him sourly through the peep sight. A tentacle seemed to twitch impatiently at the trigger. After all, the linguist thought rapidly, a facial expression such as a smile is probably meaningless to him. I shall have to make a more significant sign, as in that sketch. He unbuckled his holster belt and carefully laid it to one side, handguns and all. Still no response. He walked forward halfway to the native, holding up his open hands. He recited his speech, then, and stood waiting. With his first words, the other's attitude changed. The gun was lowered slowly while the native stared at him with big, black, disc-like eyes. He stared back, examining the bright red native with interest. Long feet, with 2 toes like pincers, heavily muscled legs, middle limbs like arms, with short, powerful hands of a sort, 2 6-fingered tentacles growing out from the sides of the head. One of the middle limbs reached out and tugged at his arm experimentally. The native said something evidently meaning "come along." Stewart walked along with him, reporting "okay, so far," into his radio. The two beings walked up to the entrance to the cave, from where the scout ship could just be seen. Suddenly the smaller native sprang out of the brush and backed the linguist against the tree, holding the crossbow almost at his throat. The first native whirled, aimed the blast rifle at the scout ship, and fired. There was a flash at the ship's bow, and a deep gash was blasted into the metal. "Aru," said the natives. Stewart's earphone crackled, but the signal was weak. "What's going on?" came Gordon's voice, faintly. "Get away from them and we'll blow them to smithereens." He tried to think clearly. "I don't know how to get away," he realized miserably. Never had any of that combat training. He found the native with the blast rifle chattering at him. The other had withdrawn the crossbow from his throat. "I'm all right," he reported weakly. He listened to the native a moment, then added, "This is rather puzzling, though. They actually seem friendly. I believe one of them is telling me that we're friends now." "That lousy iron hill you're on is killing your signal, Stewart. I can hardly hear you. You're in plain sight, though, through the telescope. Shall we come after you?" The natives were pulling at the linguist's arm, urging him toward the cave. "No, keep out of sight a while," he shouted, shaking his head. "I believe they want me to come with them." The reply from the special agent was unintelligible. Stewart allowed the Azurans to guide him into the cave. He was not surprised to find it the end of a long tunnel through the coral. 2 other natives came running past and took up positions as guards just inside the entrance. The phosphorescent material of the hill itself supplied a feeble light. There seemed to be an alarm system of some sort, for handles were set into small square boxes on the walls every 50 meters or so. During the hour-long walk, Stewart learned bits of the natives' language. If one could apply the hitherto universally valid criteria of the Linguistic Academy, he decided, this language represented a long history of high culture and philosophical achievement. He found the idea encouraging. He was already constructing simple sentences when the tunnel turned sharply and entered a small cave. It was really an underground room, he noticed, with several corridors leading away. One of his guides pulled a lever. A moment later a dozen other natives entered the room. With them was a monkey rat, sporting Roger's 2 hunting knives. It pointed to the linguist and chattered shrilly. The linguist recognized one of the Azurans as the one he had caught. The first to enter, however, seemed considerably older than the rest. Stuart guessed he was a high official. The elderly one approached the Earthman and held out his tentacles to the sides. It seemed to mean something. There was a short, tense silence. "Of course!" exclaimed Stuart to himself. The gesture of peaceful intent, showing the absence of weapons. He held up his hands, likewise empty, and repeated his speech. There were murmurs of Aru. Around him, unobtrusive weapons were unobtrusively lowered. Sketching materials were brought to the official, sheets of something like parchment, and a red which exuded an inky substance through a fine hole. 2 blocks of what seemed to be extraordinarily soft wood were carried in. The official sat down, somewhat in human fashion, and motioned the language expert to do likewise. The conversation lasted almost 2 hours. Stuart, by sketching and using a few words, explained his mission. The natives seemed to understand. Judging by their awareness of the outer universe, they had considerable scientific knowledge. He guessed, though, that their technology was more biological than mechanical. They knew where the invaders were from, what they had looked like, and how some of their mechanisms had operated. But Azuran culture, never warlike, had been unable to strike back, and had been so badly smashed that there had been no opportunity to use the captured knowledge. "They nearly destroyed my people," explained the official with words and pictures. "We were many millions. Now only thousands. We saved what we could and hid underground, scattered. For 5 years we have struggled to stay alive. Now we are regaining our strength and can think of building again. But always we must be ready for the invaders. They killed for nothing or for amusement. Took nothing except specimens. Apparently they wanted nothing here but sport. They simply attacked without warning one day, all over the planet, and hunted us for 54 days. Then they disappeared. We caught a few live ones outside their ships by trickery, and we captured 2 small ships the same way. But in our difficulty we have had little time to investigate the ships." "Where are the captured creatures?" asked Stuart. "Oh, they did not live long." The other's manner did not indicate regret. "They needed high temperature and a special atmosphere to stay alive, and of course we had an adequate means to care for them. We made very thorough biological studies of them, however." He shook his tentacles, as if in disgust. "They were remarkably unpleasant. Colorless, and gritty to the touch. Completely hateful. They used to throw dissected specimens of our people out of their ships, sometimes live people were dropped." He nodded toward the blast rifle. "You are good to offer weapons. From certain records we found, we believe the enemy will return soon. I understand your need for a base here. I can speak for my people, what is left of them. We accept your offer. Come down again tomorrow to the clearing in your big ship. Our highest leader will be present, and a treaty will be made." Abruptly, thus, the interview was over. The old native was obviously tired. The linguist got to his feet, intending to express his pleasure at the outcome. He had his mouth open, and it stayed that way when the blast rifle was suddenly thrust into his hands. The official, who had handed it to him, put a tentacle on his shoulder in what Stuart recognized as a gesture of friendship. The linguist grinned, put his hand on the other's shoulder, and handed back the weapon. There was a great din of whistling and cries of "Aru! Aru now lo!" It became a sort of cheer, with a crowd of natives following Stuart and his 3 guides back down the tunnel. The old official stood and watched them go. Back in the daylight, the linguist was startled to discover that Procyon was low in the sky and that night was near. He hurried down the path toward his scout ship to get away from the Iron Hill. Hastily he switched on his radio. Before he could catch his breath enough to talk, he heard White's voice. "Hey, I see him. There he is, Chief, there's the little guy." Sounds of the drive being activated came through the earphone. Gordon's voice cut in. "You okay, Stuart?" Yes, I'm all right. Come on down, peaceably." "What's the deal?" "They're convinced. They'll have their president, or whatever, here in the morning to sign a treaty with us." "What?" A moment later the big ship landed with a silent rush, flattening out a large expanse of scrub. The ground crunched under it. A dozen wide-eyed natives watched from a respectful distance. The lower port flew open. Gordon and Rogers came scrambling down the ladder. The 2 men came running over, handguns swinging heavily at their sides. The turret guns were trained on the hill before the cave. "Is this on the level?" demanded Gordon. "Yes. I'll explain later, after I've had some sleep." The captain fell on the scout ship. "Looks like your ship will navigate all right," he said, still out of breath. "Probably have to replace the autopilot and tracker, though. But why in blazes did they take a shot at it? And why wasn't your defensive field on?" The linguist kicked a pebble. "I forgot to ask them why they did that. I guess they figured my gesture of offering a weapon didn't mean much unless I was vulnerable to the weapon myself. Or maybe they felt that, if I came in good faith, I'd come without protection. Anyway, they didn't want to shoot me just to find out, so they tested it on the ship and decided I was, on the level. If it had been on, they'd probably have shot me immediately with the crossbow. Or maybe they'd have figured out what the glow was and shot me without testing it. Then they'd have gone back in the tunnel and sealed it up for good." He suddenly laughed aloud, face light with pleasure and surprised realization. "For the first time on this trip, I'm glad I've never had any military experience. If I'd been well trained, that field would have been turned on." Gordon's strained face relaxed. He looked at Stuart in awe, and put an arm around his shoulders. After a moment he said, musingly, "What do we do next? We've got to get back, but we also ought to see this through when the brass gets here." Stuart's reply was prompt. "You go back. Leave me food for a couple of days and tell patrol to bring me what I need for a long stay. I'll see this thing through. Can I take a picture of you tomorrow with the Azura Big Chief? It'd look swell in the papers back home." Gordon's tone was bantering. The linguist looked him in the eye. "I wish you would," he said, soberly.